Imagine you are standing on a rain-slicked wooden dock in 15th century London.
Oh, that is a bleak picture.
Right. The air smells of Thames mud, wood smoke, and, well, unwashed bodies. Now imagine a ship pulling into the harbor, and as the cargo is unloaded, the dock workers are handed their annual bonuses.
And we're not talking about cash here.
Exactly. They aren't handed gold, they aren't handed silver shillings, they are handed a small pouch of cloves.
Which is wild to think about today.
It really is. Imagine a reality where the mapping of entire continents, the brutal rise and fall of global empires, and the slaughter of tens of thousands of people are all violently set into motion just to flavor a dish of roasted boar and, cure a persistent winter cough.
Yeah, a cough.
Welcome to the deep dive. You are about to step into a world that might seem entirely alien, yet it serves as the exact structural blueprint for the modern global economy you live in today.
It truly is the blueprint. I mean, there is a pervasive tendency to assume globalization is a relatively recent phenomenon.
Right, like we invented it.
Yeah, we think it's something that arrived with the laying of transatlantic telegraph cables or the invention of the shipping container or the rise of the internet. But if you look closely at the mechanics of the spice trade, you realize it was the original multinational enterprise.
It really was.
It was the first time humanity constructed a truly, global commercial network. And the most crucial thing to understand right out of the gate is that this wasn't just about taste.
That is the biggest misconception we have to dismantle.
Exactly. This was about power. It was about status. Spices were incredibly high-density stores of value. If you want a modern equivalent, think of them as the advanced microchips or the enriched uranium of the 15th century.
And that is exactly the mission we have today. We are going to completely deconstruct humanity's first global commercial network.
We have a lot to cover.
We really do. We have an incredible, towering stack of sources in front of us to help you make sense of this. We are looking at comprehensive historical analyses of the pre-1511 global spice trade.
Some really fascinating stuff in there.
Yeah, and we have deeply granular research papers from the International Journal of Education and Social Science Research, the IJES, that break down the intense, often overlooked maritime conflicts between the Ottoman Empire and the Portuguese.
The naval warfare aspect is just insane.
It's mind-blowing. Plus, we have complex economic breakdowns of medieval supply chains. We are going to track the journey of spices from tiny, active volcanic islands in the Pacific all the way to European palaces.
It's quite a journey.
We are going to unravel the massive geopolitical shockwaves, the carefully constructed corporate myths, and the specific economic policies that quite literally birthed the modern world.
And we should probably put a quick disclaimer out there.
Oh, absolutely. Because we are going to be talking about 32,000% profit margins and Renaissance-era cartels. Please remember, this is a historical deep dive, and this is not financial advice.
Yeah, I think that disclaimer is entirely appropriate here.
Better safe than sorry.
Because the kind of raw speculation, the leverage, and the staggering risk-taking we see in this era makes modern venture capital look incredibly conservative.
Like child's play.
Exactly. To really grasp the magnitude of the spice trade, you have to look at the structural mechanics of it. From a free market, capital-driven perspective, it is a masterclass in innovation.
You have entrepreneurs risking everything.
Including their lives. They risked it all to break established monopolies. But if you look at it from a labor-focused perspective, it is a harrowing story of systemic exploitation.
Yeah, the human cost was massive.
It was. The subsistence farmers who physically cultivated the crops saw absolutely none of the wealth they generated. And if you consider the perspective of the ordinary folks of the era, they were essentially watching this billionaire's space race from the sidelines.
Just entirely removed from the economic reality of the commodities themselves.
Right.
I want to start right there, actually, with the ordinary folks and the day-to-day reality of medieval Europe. Because I'm looking at these notes from the historical researcher Elizabeth Chadwick, and I have to stop you.
Okay, what did you find?
This fundamentally breaks the way most of us are taught history. The rotten meat theory. It's practically gospel in high school classrooms.
Oh, the rotten meat myth.
Yes. The assumption is that medieval kings and nobles only imported massive quantities of pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg because their food was constantly spoiling.
Right, the idea being they needed it to cover up the taste.
The narrative goes that without refrigeration, they just dumped heavy spices over rotting beef to mask the horrific stench and taste. Are you telling me that narrative is completely fabricated?
It is entirely fabricated.
Yeah.
Chadwick's research tears that myth apart, and when you actually look at the underlying economics of medieval estate management, the rotten meat theory collapses instantly.
Make it make sense for me.
Think about the logistical mechanics of wealth in the Middle Ages. Wealth was land. If you were wealthy enough to afford imported Asian spices, which were astronomically expensive, you owned vast estates.
You owned everything.
You owned the forests, the deer, the wild boar, the cattle, the sheep, and the fish ponds. You had a massive staff dedicated to hunting, slaughtering, and preparing your food daily.
So you weren't eating old meat.
Not at all. You were eating the freshest meat available in Europe.
So the idea that a duke is sitting in a castle eating spoiled pork just doesn't track with his actual access to resources.
It defies basic economic logic. If you can afford to import black pepper from the Malabar coast of India, you can certainly afford a fresh chicken.
Right.
And when you look at how meat was actually preserved back then, the primary method was salt.
Good old souls.
Salt was cheap, abundant, and highly effective at drawing out moisture and preventing bacterial growth. They also used smoking and drying techniques.
Which brings us to the ordinary folks. If the nobles are eating fresh meat, what are the peasants doing?
The laborers and the peasantry were the ones who actually relied on preserved meats. Salt pork, dried fish, heavily salted beef. That was to survive the winter.
Right.
But here is the critical distinction. They could not afford a single peppercorn, let alone a pound of nutmeg.
It was completely out of reach.
Totally. To flavor their salted meats, they relied entirely on what they could cultivate in their own garden plots.
Like what?
They used local, easily grown herbs, garlic, leeks, chives, mustard seed, and sage.
So you have this stark divide. The people eating the preserved, potentially questionable meat couldn't afford spices, and the people who could afford the spices were eating incredibly fresh, premium meat.
Exactly.
Okay, that completely shifts the paradigm. If they aren't dumping saffron on their food to hide the taste of decay, what is the actual mechanism driving this insatiable demand?
It's a great question.
Why did the household of the Duke of Buckingham in 15th century England document using 2 pounds of exotic spices every single day? That is an industrial level of consumption for one household.
It really is. To understand that, you have to understand a complex economic concept known as a Veblen good.
A Veblen good. Okay, unpack that for us.
Thorstein Veblen was an economist who identified a specific type of luxury item that completely contradicts the basic laws of supply and demand.
How so?
Well, normally as the price of a good goes up, the demand goes down.
Right.
That's Economics 101. But with a Veblen good, the demand actually increases as the price goes up.
Wait, really? The more expensive it is, the more people want it.
Exactly. The exorbitant price itself is the primary feature, not a bug, because it signals extreme social status and exclusivity to everyone else.
Give me a modern equivalent so we can ground this. Are we talking about something like a limited edition hypercar or a designer handbag?
Precisely. If you buy a Rolex, you aren't buying it because it tells time better than a $10 digital watch.
Right, my phone tells the time perfectly.
You buy it because everyone else knows how much a Rolex costs. It is a broadcast of your financial power. Spices were the ultimate 15th century Veblen good.
So it was just showing off.
Purely. At noble feasts, the goal wasn't merely to season the food for taste. The goal was to overwhelm the senses of your guests, to prove your wealth. We have documented records of English noble recipes where an astonishing 90% of the dishes called for heavy, complex spicing.
And it wasn't just the taste either, it was the visual spectacle.
Oh, absolutely.
I was reading about how they used saffron. They wouldn't just mix it into the dough, they would use it as a literal paint.
Yes.
They would brush a baked pie with a wash of saffron, which we should note is still one of the most expensive spices in the world today because it requires hand-picking the tiny stigmas of crocus flowers.
It's incredibly labor-intensive.
Right. They would paint the food so that it came out of the oven gleaming like a golden artifact. You were essentially serving your guests edible gold.
That is exactly the right way to look at it. It was a conspicuous, edible display of geopolitical reach and immense capital.
Wow.
But we cannot limit our understanding of spices to just culinary flexing. There were massive life-or-death mechanisms driving demand, specifically in medicine and religion.
Okay, let's get into the medicine, because you have to put yourself in the mindset of a medieval European before the advent of the scientific method or germ theory.
Right, it was a completely different worldview.
The sources dive heavily into the Galenic theory of humors. How did that actually work in practice? Because it sounds completely bizarre to a modern ear.
It does. The entire foundation of European medicine at the time was based on maintaining a delicate balance of the body's four humors:
Which were?
blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. They categorized everything: food, climate, illnesses, and human temperaments, on a spectrum of hot to cold and wet to dry.
Okay.
The prevailing medical belief was that the typical European diet, particularly the heavy reliance on fish and certain meats, was inherently cold and wet.
And an excess of cold and wet humors leads to illness.
Exactly. So, to maintain your physical health and balance your internal ecosystem, your physician would prescribe things that were categorized as hot and dry.
And spices fit that bill.
Asian spices fit that precise medical profile perfectly. They weren't just flavorings, they were high-grade pharmaceuticals. Black pepper, for instance, was heavily prescribed for respiratory issues like coughs and asthma because its heat was believed to cut through the cold phlegm.
That is fascinating.
Nutmeg was considered a potent cure for any disease believed to be caused by humidity and coldness in the air.
I want to pause on nutmeg for a second because the psychological weight of this specific spice during the bubonic plague is staggering.
It really is.
You have to imagine living through the Black Death. You don't know what a bacterium is. You don't know fleas on rats are spreading the disease. You look around and you see that disease seems to spread in crowded, foul-smelling areas.
So what is the logical conclusion?
The smell itself is the vector.
Exactly. The theory of miasmas. They believed that bad air or foul odors physically carried the plague. And in a medieval city without a sewage system, bad air was everywhere.
So the wealthy response was to build a wearable olfactory force field.
A force field's a great way to put it.
They use these devices called pomanders. For those who haven't seen one in a museum, picture a hollow, incredibly ornate sphere made of gold or silver, usually perforated with intricate patterns.
Beautiful objects.
Yeah, and inside they would pack it with a highly concentrated paste of ambergris, musk, and massive amounts of nutmeg, cinnamon, and cloves. Queen Elizabeth I famously carried a pomander with her everywhere she went.
She did.
They would hold it up to their noses when walking through the streets to filter the bad air.
It is a perfect parallel to how you might view immune-boosting supplements or high-end air purifiers during a modern health crisis,
Oh,
but magnified 1,000-fold by the sheer existential terror of a plague that was wiping out a third of the continent.
it's terrifying.
If you believed that a handful of nutmeg was the only thing standing between you and a gruesome death, there was virtually no limit to the price you would pay for it.
That perfectly bridges the gap to the religious applications. Because if bad smells are equated with disease and death, then good smells, these incredibly rare exotic aromas, must be equated with purity and the divine.
That was the exact theological leap. The medieval world was, frankly, an olfactory nightmare.
I can't even imagine.
The streets were unpaved and filled with animal waste, butchery offal, and human refuse. Bathing was infrequent. So when you entered a grand cathedral and smelled the heavy, intoxicating aroma of burning frankincense and myrrh, it was a literal, physical transport to another realm.
Spices were dubbed the scent of heaven.
They literally were.
And the church was an absolutely massive consumer.
Mhm.
They needed vast quantities of incense for the daily mass across thousands of parishes, perfumes to anoint religious icons, and spices for embalming high-ranking officials.
The demand was constant.
We know frankincense and myrrh were prized alongside gold. I mean, the biblical story of the Magi establishes that early on.
Right.
But the sheer volume and consumption in antiquity is hard to wrap your head around. The sources note that Emperor Nero burned an entire year's worth of the Arabian harvest of frankincense at the funeral of his wife, Poppaea.
Just burned it all.
That is an astonishing destruction of wealth, just to make a point.
It demonstrates that you have a commodity that functions simultaneously as the ultimate status symbol, a life-saving pharmaceutical, and a direct sensory line to God. With those three pillars of demand, it is no wonder humans were willing to cross oceans and slaughter each other for it.
But this is where the narrative usually gets incredibly Eurocentric, and I want us to course correct based on the research.
Let's do it.
The standard story assumes this whole global network starts with Europeans. Columbus trying to sail west, Vasco da Gama sailing south. But the Europeans were actually incredibly late to the party, weren't they?
Oh, extremely late.
If we are talking about the true pioneers of the global spice trade, we have to rewind the clock significantly.
By millennia. If you want to identify the true, original pioneers, the OGs of the global spice trade, you have to look at the Austronesian peoples of maritime Southeast Asia. We are talking about activity as early as 1500 BC.
1500 BC. That is roughly 3,500 years ago.
Yep.
To put that in perspective for you, that is around the time the New Kingdom of Egypt is just starting to hit its stride. It's centuries before the founding of Rome. And you're telling me these maritime groups are already navigating the deep ocean. How?
Through astonishingly advanced naval engineering that Europe wouldn't rival for thousands of years.
Like what?
The Austronesians developed the outrigger canoe. By attaching a secondary parallel float to the main hull, they created a vessel that was incredibly stable in deep ocean swells, preventing it from capsizing.
Genius.
They also developed lashed lug boat building, where the planks of the hull are sewn together with strong, natural fibers rather than nailed.
Wait, sewn together?
Yeah, stitched with fibers.
Yeah.
It allowed the ship to flex and absorb the impact of massive waves without shattering. And crucially, they invented the crab claw sail, which allowed them to tack against the wind with incredible efficiency.
So they aren't just hugging the coastline, they are crossing open water.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Using these technologies, they navigated the vast expanses of the Indian Ocean. They traveled from the Maluku Islands in modern-day Indonesia all the way across the ocean to Sri Lanka and the southern coast of India.
That's a massive distance.
It's incredible. They were the ones who brought the very first cloves and nutmeg out of the archipelago. They even sailed as far as Madagascar and colonized it.
Wow.
They single-handedly established the foundational maritime routes that would eventually evolve into the Maritime Silk Road.
And once those routes are established, the ancient powers start tapping into them. You have the Egyptians sending expeditions down the Red Sea to the land of Punt in the 3rd millennium BC to get myrrh and frankincense. You have the Romans, centuries later, building a massive trade network via the Red Sea to India. Our sources actually point out a fascinating linguistic legacy from that Roman era.
Oh, the salary connection.
Yes, Roman soldiers were frequently paid their wages in salt, a vital preservative. The Latin word for salt is sal, and the allowance given to soldiers was the salarium.
Which is the exact origin of the modern English word salary. It shows how deeply these ancient commodity trades are baked into our daily lives.
It's wild.
But as the Roman Empire fractures and falls, the geopolitical center of gravity shifts. By the time we reach the Islamic Golden Age, roughly the 8th to the 15th century, Arab and Persian merchants have completely dominated the Indian Ocean trade routes.
They step into the vacuum.
They become the ultimate, undisputed middlemen of the medieval world.
But how did they maintain that dominance for so long? This is the part that always confuses me. If you have a product that every monarch, every physician, and every priest in Europe is desperate for, wouldn't someone in Europe eventually just figure out how to bypass the middlemen and go straight to the source?
This is where we have to introduce another vital economic concept:
Lay it on me.
information asymmetry. Information asymmetry occurs when one party in an economic transaction possesses significantly more or better information than the other party.
Okay, give me a modern example.
Think of the 2008 financial crisis. The bankers selling complex mortgage-backed securities understood exactly what was in those toxic assets.
Right.
But the buyers had no idea. In the medieval spice trade, the Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants knew exactly where the spices grew. These tiny, remote volcanic islands in Indonesia and the humid coasts of Kerala in India.
And Europe was in the dark.
Totally in the dark. The European buyer sitting in Venice or London had absolutely zero geographic knowledge of the source.
So the middlemen weaponized the mystery.
Exactly. They weaponized the mystery to justify their massive markups. Economists refer to this as extracting a protection rent.
Protection rent.
Yes. If a European merchant complains that the price of cinnamon is absurdly high, the Arab trader can't just say, well, I sailed to Sri Lanka and bought it for pennies.
Right, because then the European tries to sail to Sri Lanka.
Exactly. That invites competition. Instead, they invented wild, fantastical myths to explain the cost and deter anyone from trying to find the source.
And these myths were widely accepted as geographical fact by the Greeks, the Romans, and later the Europeans. One of my favorites from the texts is the story of the Cynomologus.
Oh, the giant birds.
Yes. The Arab traders claimed that cinnamon didn't grow on trees you could just harvest. They claimed it was gathered from the nests of giant, fierce, eagle-like birds built on sheer, inaccessible limestone cliffs.
And how do you get the cinnamon down? The myth claims you had to chop up massive pieces of lead-weighted meat and leave them at the bottom of the cliff.
Naturally.
The giant birds would swoop down, carry the impossibly heavy meat up to their nests, and the weight would cause the nest to collapse and fall to the ground.
Allowing the traders to quickly grab the cinnamon and run before the birds attacked them.
It's brilliant.
I mean, listen, I'd love to give you a discount on this cinnamon, but a giant prehistoric eagle almost killed my cousin, so the price is the price.
That's exactly how it worked. And they did the same thing with pepper, didn't they?
They did. They claimed that black pepper grew in deep, treacherous valleys guarded by swarms of flying, venomous serpents.
Sounds like a movie.
Right. The story went that to safely harvest the pepper, the brave traders had to set the entire valley on fire to drive the serpents away. They claimed that it was this massive, intense fire that scorched the peppercorns, giving black pepper its characteristic, dark, shriveled appearance.
It is genuinely incredible marketing.
It really is. But let's look at the actual logistics of this trade, devoid of the myths. Because when you strip away the giant birds, you are left with a massively complex, multi-ethnic, multilingual commercial network.
Highly complex.
You have Austronesians, Indians, Arabs, Persians, Chinese, and Venetians all interacting. How on earth did they negotiate contracts, agree on tariffs, and manage disputes without modern translation tools or international commercial law?
It required highly sophisticated linguistic and administrative strategies. Linguistically, the entire Indian Ocean operated on a lingua franca.
A bridge language.
Yes, a lingua franca is systematically adopted to make communication possible between groups who do not share a native dialect. In this massive maritime network, a hybridized form of Malay, heavily infused with Arabic, Persian, and eventually Portuguese terms, served this purpose.
So it wasn't exactly poetry?
No, it wasn't the language of poetry, it was the language of commerce.
Yeah.
It was precise enough to negotiate weights, measures, and exchange rates.
But speaking the same trade language doesn't prevent contract disputes. I mean, if a Gujarati merchant claims a Chinese merchant shortchanged him in the port of Malacca, how is that resolved?
Administratively, they relied on a brilliant institution known as the Shahbandar system.
Shahbandar.
Yes, the Shahbandar translates roughly to Lord of the Haven or the Courtmaster. But unlike a modern customs official, a major cosmopolitan hub like the Malacca Sultanate wouldn't just have one Shahbandar. They had multiple. They were specifically appointed to oversee different ethnic merchant communities.
That makes so much sense. So it's customized jurisdiction.
Exactly. The Sultan of Malacca would appoint a Gujarati Shahbandar to manage the Gujarati traders, a Chinese Shahbandar for the Ming merchants, and an Arab Shahbandar for the Middle Eastern fleets.
So you're dealing with your own people.
Right. These officials, often foreigners themselves who had settled in the port, were responsible for collecting the Sultan's tariffs, allocating warehouse space, and, critically, mediating disputes using the cultural and commercial norms familiar to their specific community.
That is so smart.
It brilliantly lubricated the wheels of a massively complex, multinational commercial network, reducing friction and ensuring the port remained a highly attractive place to do business.
Okay, this brings up a massive geopolitical question that has always baffled me.
What's that?
If you look at the map of Asia in the early 1400s, you have the Ming Dynasty in China. They are the undisputed, absolute superpower of the East.
Unrivaled.
They have Admiral Zheng, he commanding the legendary treasure fleets. For context, these Chinese ships were staggering leviathans. They had 9 masts, watertight bulkheads, and were several times larger than the tiny caravels the Europeans would sail a century later.
They're essentially floating cities.
Yeah. And the Spice Islands are practically in China's backyard compared to Europe. So why didn't the Ming Emperor just sail down there, plant a flag, conquer the Maluku Islands, and monopolize the most lucrative trade on the planet?
It is one of the greatest what-ifs in economic history.
It seems like such an obvious move.
And to understand why China didn't conquer the Spice Islands, you have to apply the economic theory of comparative advantage.
Okay, another economic term. Break it down.
This principle, formalized much later by David Ricardo, states that an economy should focus on producing and exporting goods where it has the lowest opportunity cost compared to other nations, even if it is technically capable of producing everything.
So what was China's comparative advantage?
Ming China was already the absolute unrivaled master of producing the most highly valued, high-margin manufactured luxury goods on the planet.
Silk and porcelain.
Refined silk, high-quality porcelain, and tea. The entire world was desperate for these products, and only China had the massive specialized agrarian and artisanal infrastructure to produce them at scale.
I see. So if you are the Ming Emperor and your domestic economy is printing money through silk and porcelain, diverting a massive amount of state resources, military garrisons, administrative bureaucracy, naval patrols to go conquer and manage distant volcanic islands full of subsistence farmers just to control the raw spice supply,
It's actually a terrible return on
such
investment.
a massive waste of capital and focus.
China didn't need to own the dirt the nutmeg grew in. They operated on the Central Kingdom model, specifically utilizing the Nanhai or Southern Seas system.
How did that work?
They recognized that it was far more efficient to let the complex web of Austronesian, Indian, and Arab merchants handle the dangerous logistics of maritime shipping.
So instead of hard military conquest, they used soft power.
Pure, soft power, backed by the implicit threat of the treasure fleets. They set up a tributary framework. Let's look at Malacca, which sits on the Strait of Malacca, the vital choke point between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea.
Very strategic location.
Extremely. Malacca was constantly under threat of invasion from the Ayutthaya Kingdom of Siam to the north. So China offered the Malacca Sultanate diplomatic recognition and military protection.
And in exchange.
Malacca became a vassal state, offering regular tribute to the Ming Emperor. China guaranteed the security of the ports, and the merchants of the region happily brought the spices right to the Chinese coastline.
The barbarians, as the Chinese court viewed them, delivered the goods, allowing China to trade their silk for spices without firing a shot.
Exactly.
But then, in one of the most drastic policy reversals in history, China just stop.
Yes. In the mid-15th century, following internal political struggles between the Confucian bureaucrats and the eunuchs who championed the maritime expeditions, the Ming dynasty made a massive pivot inward.
They just shut it down.
They became fiercely isolationist. They didn't just stop the treasure fleets, they literally burned the records of Zheng, his voyages, and issued the Heijin Edicts, severely restricting all private maritime trade.
That is wild.
From an economic and geopolitical standpoint, it was a catastrophic withdrawal. It created a massive power vacuum in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean.
If China had maintained its naval presence, the Portuguese would have been annihilated the moment they entered the Indian Ocean a century later.
Without a doubt, China's withdrawal directly paved the way for European dominance.
While China is burning its fleets, what are Japan and Korea doing? How do they fit into the Asian spice demand? Because it's not just Europe buying this stuff.
The regional Asian demand was enormous, but shaped by highly specific cultural practices.
Tell me about Korea first.
The Kingdom of Joseon in Korea was a strict Neo-Confucian society that heavily prioritized a stable agrarian economy over global mercantile expansion.
So they weren't sending out huge trade fleets.
No, they viewed merchants with a degree of suspicion. However, the royal court and the elite consumed significant amounts of imported spices, primarily for use in Neo-Confucian ancestral rituals and traditional medicine.
And Japan.
In Muromachi-era Japan, you had this beautiful flowering of Zen Buddhist culture, which utilized Southeast Asian spices like cloves, sandalwood, and agar wood in highly formalized, deeply philosophical incense ceremonies known as kodo.
Kodo.
Yes. The ability to identify different imported woods and spices by scent was a mark of extreme aristocratic refinement.
Wow.
But Japan had a massive political problem. The Chinese Ming dynasty had banned all direct trade with Japanese merchants
Why? What did Japan do?
because of the Woku problem. The
Woku.
Woku were heavily armed, multi-ethnic pirate fleets, many based in Japan, that were relentlessly raiding the Chinese coastline. So Ming China shut the door on Japan.
If China shut the door, how did the Japanese elites get the Southeast Asian spices for their incense ceremonies?
They engineered brilliant geopolitical workarounds.
Oh, I love a good workaround.
Wealthy, politically connected Japanese merchant houses, like the famous Chaya family, would dispatch hundreds of sailors in large, heavily armed ships called Red Seal ships.
Okay.
They couldn't go to China, so they sailed to neutral, third-party ports in Southeast Asia, most notably Hoi An in central Vietnam.
The neutral ground.
Yes. The Nguyen lords of Vietnam welcomed everyone. So in the port of Hoi An, Japanese merchants could safely meet with Chinese merchants who had smuggled silk out of the Ming Empire and Southeast Asian merchants carrying spices.
Just a massive black market hub.
Exactly. The Japanese would trade their massive domestic reserves of silver for the silk and spices, effectively bypassing the imperial embargoes through a neutral proxy market.
Okay, we have covered the aristocratic demand, the medical myths, the Asian empires, and the neutral proxy ports. Let's do the math. Let's follow the money.
This is where it gets crazy.
I want to construct a massive theoretical walkthrough. I want you, the listener, to picture a single dollar of nutmeg. We are going to track that theoretical $1 from a tree branch in Indonesia all the way to a silver platter in London during the late 1400s.
A great exercise.
And we must add a heavy disclaimer here. We are using rough historical estimates to illustrate the macroeconomic reality. This is not exact, to the penny, double entry accounting.
Understood. Let's trace the supply chain.
All right, step one.
Step one is origin. You have to understand the extreme geographic bottleneck of these spices. Nutmeg and its sister spice, mace, only grew in one place on the entire planet, the Banda Islands.
Just one place.
Yes, the Bandas are a tiny, microscopic cluster of active volcanic islands in the Banda Sea. Cloves were similarly restricted to just 5 small volcanic islands in North Maluku, islands like Ternate and Tidore.
And who is actually harvesting this stuff?
The farmers there harvested the crops that literally built global empires, but they lived largely in subsistence. They were the bottom of the pyramid.
So our $1 of nutmeg starts in the volcanic soil of the Bandas. Where is its first stop?
The first leg of the journey is highly localized and incredibly dangerous. The spices are purchased by local Southeast Asian traders and loaded onto small, lashed-lug outrigger boats called prayos.
The Prayos.
These small vessels navigate the treacherous reef-filled archipelago, dodging local pirates and seasonal storms, making their way to the Malacca Sultanate.
Because Malacca is the hub.
As we discussed, Malacca was the great mixing bowl, the primary transshipment hub where merchants from the east and west converged.
So the nutmeg changes hands in Malacca, the local trader takes his cut, and the massive markups begin.
Yes. From Malacca, we enter the second major leg. The spices are bought in bulk by powerful Indian Gujarati merchants or Arab traders. They're loaded deep into the holds of much larger ocean-going vessels like Chinese junks or Arab dhows.
Across the ocean.
Exactly. They now have to cross the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, aiming for the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf.
And this leg isn't just about sailing, it's about waiting.
Yes. They are entirely dependent on the monsoon winds. The southwest monsoon blows from April to September, carrying ships toward India and the Middle East.
But then they have to wait.
They have to wait months in foreign ports, paying warehousing fees and bribes, until the northeast monsoon shifts direction in the winter to carry them back. Time is money, and the monsoon delays added massive carrying costs to the cargo.
And who is financing this incredibly slow, risky leg of the journey? I mean, who is bankrolling this?
During the 14th and 15th centuries, this leg was largely dominated by a highly organized, deeply capitalized guild of Muslim spice bankers known as the Karimi.
The Karimi.
The Karimi were essentially a massive medieval multinational corporation composed of merchants from Syria, Egypt, and Yemen. They were so wealthy, they frequently bailed out the Egyptian government.
They were bailing out governments.
They were that rich. They financed the fleets. They developed complex letters of credit that functioned much like the modern Hawala system to move money without moving gold. They absorbed the staggering risks of shipwrecks and piracy, and they fiercely controlled the flow of goods into the Middle East.
Okay, so our nutmeg has survived the coral reefs of Indonesia, the pirates of the Strait of Malacca, the monsoon winds, and a month in the open ocean, it reaches the Red Sea. Now what?
Leg 3. The cargo is unloaded at Red Sea ports like Jeddah or Tor. From there, it is transferred from ships onto the backs of camels.
Camels.
Massive, heavily guarded caravans undertake a grueling, weeks-long trek across the scorching deserts of Egypt to reach the Mediterranean port of Alexandria, or overland to Constantinople.
And here's where our $1 nutmeg hits the ultimate geopolitical bottleneck.
Yeah.
The Venetian Mamluk monopoly, what historians call the Muslim curtain.
Exactly. The Mamluk sultans of Egypt were military rulers, but they were brilliant economists. They looked at the map and realized they were sitting on the only viable gate between the wealth of the East and the desperation of Europe.
They were the ultimate toll booth operators.
So they instituted a staggering policy. They slapped a 33% ad valorem tariff on all spices passing through their territory.
Stop and think about that. 1/3 of the total value of the cargo is confiscated as a tax just for the privilege of crossing the Egyptian sand.
Yes. And waiting eagerly on the Mediterranean side of that tariff were the Venetians.
Ah, Venice.
Republic of Venice was a maritime superpower. They had used their formidable war galleys to crush their rivals, particularly the Genoese in the naval war of Chioggia, to secure a near-total exclusive monopoly on buying those spices from the Mamluks in Alexandria.
So did the Venetians try to fight that 33% tax?
They didn't try to fight the Egyptian tariff at all. They simply paid it, loaded the heavily taxed spices onto their heavily armed galleys, sailed them back to the Rialto markets in Venice, and passed the entire accumulated cost, plus their own massive profit margin, onto the European consumers.
So we have the farmers, the local prow captains, the Karimi bankers, the Mamluk toll booth, and the Venetian monopolists. By the time that theoretical $1 of nutmeg from the Banda Islands is finally grated over a bowl of porridge in London, what is the final price tag?
The historical estimates are genuinely staggering. By the time it reached the final European consumer, the price of that nutmeg had increased by approximately 32,000%.
32,000.
To put that into perspective, just the final leg buying it in the Asian markets of the Levant and selling it in Venice saw a markup of 1,000%.
32,000%. I want you to visualize this as a massive, unbalanced ledger. On the profit side, you have the stakeholders extracting immense wealth.
Huge wealth.
The Karimi Merchant Guild acting as venture capitalists, the Mamluk sultans funding their armies with that 33% gate tax, the Venetian doges building literal palaces of marble out of the water, and the wealthy ship owners.
And on the other side,
On the absolute bottom of the ledger, you have the subsistence farmers making pennies for the exact same physical product, and in the middle, eating up the margins, you have the catastrophic overhead.
right, the overhead was immense and terrifying. We mentioned the taxes and the bribes, but you have to factor in total loss scenarios. Typhoons in the South China Sea routinely wiped out entire fleets, taking millions of ducats to the bottom of the ocean.
Just gone in a night.
Cargoes could be seized by pirates, and while spices are relatively durable commodities, massive hoards sitting in humid, poorly ventilated stone warehouses in Alexandria or Venice for months on end could go stale.
Which ruins the product.
They could lose their medicinal potency or simply be eaten by rats. It was an incredibly high-risk, astronomically high-reward system.
The basic economics tells us that a 32,000% markup is basically a ticking time bomb.
It is completely unsustainable.
You cannot squeeze a market that hard forever without someone trying to break the system. So what is the catalyst? What finally shatters this ancient supply chain?
The geopolitical earthquake that shatters the medieval world happens in the year 1453.
The fall of Constantinople.
Yes, the Ottoman Turks, under the command of the young and brilliant Mehmed the Conqueror, lay siege to and capture Constantinople with massive siege cannons.
Effectively extinguishing the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire.
Exactly. And this isn't just a political shift. It is an economic cataclysm. The Ottomans slammed shut the last remaining alternative overland Silk Road roads.
Right.
Suddenly, the Muslim curtain is absolute.
And Europe is trapped.
Europe finds itself 100% at the mercy of the Venetian Mamluk cartel.
And this leads to a fundamental, immutable rule of global economics. When markets become rigidly dominated by a single provider or cartel who mercilessly squeezes the customers, those customers will vigorously, desperately explore alternatives.
The European monarchs were essentially facing bankruptcy. They were bleeding silver to Venice at an unsustainable rate just to maintain their social status and medical supplies.
They had to find a way around the monopoly.
They did. This sheer, desperate need for a bypass directly births the European Age of Discovery.
You have the Spanish trying to go west, famously crashing into the Americas. But while Spain is distracted by the New World, Portugal actually pulls off the impossible mission.
They do. The Portuguese have spent decades slowly creeping down the coast of Africa, funding their expeditions with gold and slaves. But in 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama achieves the breakthrough.
He makes it around.
He successfully navigates the treacherous waters around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. He sails up the East African coast, hires a local pilot who understands the monsoon winds, crosses the Indian Ocean, and lands in Calicut, India.
In one voyage, he completely bypasses the Middle East, he bypasses the Mamluks' 33% tax, and he bypasses the Venetian galleys entirely.
And the market reaction is instant and violent. Da Gama returns to Lisbon. Despite losing half his crew to scurvy, his cargo of India pepper yields a 6,000% profit.
Wow.
And immediately overnight, the price of pepper in Lisbon drops to 1/5 of the price in Venice.
It was a total, catastrophic market crash for the established powers. The ancient Venetian monopoly was shattered. The Venetians panicked on a systemic level. Our sources show they desperately tried to restructure.
They even moved their famous spice market, the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, trying to streamline operations.
The Egyptian Mamluk economy went into a tailspin. Portugal had effectively hijacked the central artery of global trade.
Just completely took it over.
But this is where the narrative often stops in the textbooks. Da Gama sails back, Portugal gets rich, end of story. But that is incredibly naive.
Oh, it's very naive.
If you hijack the most lucrative trade network in human history, the people you stole it from do not just peacefully accept bankruptcy. Does Portugal just seamlessly take over?
Far from it. The immediate aftermath is what historians call the Indian Ocean Cold War, stretching roughly from 1500 to 1560. But Cold War is almost a misnomer.
Because it was a hot war.
It was incredibly hot and bloody. The Portuguese didn't just show up and trade peacefully. They aggressively militarized the ocean. They created a state-sponsored maritime empire known as the Estado da India.
And their technological advantage was the caravel, right? How did a tiny fleet of European ships dominate a massive ocean filled with thousands of Arab and Indian vessels?
It came down to naval architecture and artillery. The traditional Indian Ocean vessels, the dhows and junks, were built for cargo capacity and relied on stitched hulls. The Portuguese caravels and galleons used heavy internal wooden frames.
So they were much sturdier.
They were built to withstand the massive recoil of heavy bronze cannons mounted broadside. They didn't have to board an enemy ship to defeat it. They could just stand off and blow it to pieces.
So they roll into the Indian Ocean with overwhelming firepower, and they completely dismantle the old system. They replace that fluid, cooperative lingua franca and the mediatory Shabandar system with pure extortion.
Exactly. They instituted a massive protection racket called the Cartaz system. The Portuguese demanded that every single trading ship in the Indian Ocean purchase a Cartaz, a Portuguese-issued passport. To get the passport, you had to pay a fee, and you had to agree to pay taxes at Portuguese-controlled ports.
And if you didn't have one?
If a Portuguese patrol found your ship without a Cartaz, they would confiscate your cargo, burn your ship, and often slaughter or enslave the crew. They were systematically choking off the flow of wealth to the Middle East.
And the Ottomans weren't just going to sit in Istanbul and watch their geopolitical rivals get rich while their own revenues collapse.
Not at all. The Ottoman sultans, Selim I and later Suleiman the Magnificent, were brilliant strategists. They realized their entire ambition to conquer Eastern Europe was financially threatened if they lost the spice revenues that funded their armies.
So they fight back.
They launched a massive counterattack. In 1517, Selim I invaded and conquered Egypt, wiping out the Mamluk Sultanate entirely, taking direct imperial control of the Red Sea routes.
That's a bold move.
They established major naval bases in Suez and in Basra on the Persian Gulf to push their fleets back into the Indian Ocean.
And as the Ottomans push into the Indian Ocean, they find massive support from the locals, right? Because the Portuguese are alienating absolutely everyone with their brutality.
Yes. The Portuguese made a fatal strategic error by treating all Muslim traders as hostile Crusader-era enemies. This alienated the deeply entrenched local merchant networks in India, particularly the Marakkars of Kerala.
Who were the Marakkars?
The Marakkars were wealthy, powerful maritime merchants who originally operated on the Coromandel coast. But driven out by Portuguese aggression, they shifted their operations to Calicut and formed a powerful military alliance with the local Hindu ruler, the Zamarin.
Who was also fighting the Portuguese.
Exactly. The Zamarin was fighting a desperate war against Portuguese encroachment.
The Marakkar Alliance. These guys were legendary naval commanders. They didn't try to fight the heavily armed Portuguese galleons head-on in deep water, did they?
No, they used brilliant asymmetric guerrilla naval warfare. Figures like Kunjali Marakkar and Kutiali became the bane of the Portuguese Empire.
Tell me about Kutiali.
Interestingly, Kutiali had initially tried to operate within the Portuguese system as a legitimate merchant. But after a corrupt Portuguese governor betrayed him, illegally confiscated his cargo, and stole his ship, he turned his entire massive fleet into a corsair force dedicated to destroying Portuguese shipping.
Talk about creating your own worst enemy through pure arrogance. How did the Marakkars actually fight back against those big ships?
They used small, incredibly fast, shallow draft-oared boats. They would hide in the intricate river estuaries and mangrove swamps of the Malabar coast, wait for a large, clumsy Portuguese galleon to get becalmed without wind, and then swarm it with hundreds of men.
Just completely overwhelm them.
Using fire arrows and boarding tactics. Furthermore, they developed a massive shadow trade network. They used the remote coral atolls of the Maldives as a staging ground to smuggle spices from Southeast Asia directly to the Ottoman-controlled Red Sea ports.
completely bypassing the heavily fortified Portuguese coastal patrols in India.
Exactly.
And the Ottomans eventually bring serious state-level muscle to back up this resistance.
They do, but at an astronomical logistical cost. To fight the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, the Ottomans had to construct heavily armed Mediterranean-style war galleys.
Right.
But there are no forests in the deserts of Suez or Basra.
So where did they get the wood?
The Ottomans engaged in an incredible feat of logistics. They harvested massive timber from the Taurus Mountains in modern-day Turkey, floated the logs down the Euphrates River all the way to Basra, and built the fleets there.
That is insane. They floated the trees down the river.
Yes. They even hired elite Armenian mercenaries and Venetian shipwrights. They launched massive state-sponsored naval sieges against Portuguese fortress cities in India, most notably the Siege of Diu in 1538 and again in 1546.
And the Portuguese held on.
The Portuguese Empire in Asia only survived by pouring all their resources into heavily fortifying key strongholds like Goa, Cochin, and Bassein. It was a literal global clash of empires, spanning from the Mediterranean to Indonesia, fought entirely over control of peppercorns and cloves.
Which brings us to a darker, more insidious side of this history. When you have a commodity with a 32,000% markup, and you have empires fighting open wars over it, you inevitably spawn a massive, sophisticated underworld.
The shadow economy of spices was incredibly dangerous. Because spices were so astronomically valuable, and because they were mostly sold to the end consumer ground into powders by apothecaries, they were uniquely ripe for fraud.
Oh, adulteration.
Adulteration was a systemic issue across Europe. Unscrupulous merchants would mix pure ground pepper with dirt, ground mustard husks, or even just floor sweepings to illegally stretch their inventory.
That's disgusting.
Cities had to employ specialized garblers just to inspect and attempt to purify imported spices.
But the danger goes far beyond just getting ripped off by a corrupt grocer. Because spices were so heavily intertwined with medicine, they were deeply associated with lethal court intrigue and assassination.
Exactly. Because spices were heavily used by physicians to mask the foul flavors of actual medicines, they were the absolute perfect vehicle for poison.
Just slip it right in.
If a dish was heavily spiced with saffron and clove, you couldn't taste the arsenic. Our sources share a fascinating, deeply revealing anecdote about St. Bridget of Sweden.
What happened with her?
During her intense political and religious maneuverings in the 14th century, she deliberately used metaphors of poisoned vessels and spicy prayers. She accused her enemies of offering seemingly pious, heavily spiced words that were actually lethal spiritual poison.
Wow.
The psychological association between exotic spices, apothecary vials, and sudden, agonizing death was very, very real in the medieval mind.
And the violence wasn't just individual assassinations in dark corridors. It was massive state-sponsored slaughter over decades. We've talked about the Portuguese and the Ottomans in the 1500s, but the blood spilled for spices goes back centuries earlier. Look at the naval war of Chioggia from 1378 to 1381.
Right, the Italian states.
You have the two Italian maritime superpowers, Venice and Genoa, fighting an absolute war of annihilation, blockading each other in the Venetian lagoon, starving each other's populations, specifically to determine who gets to control the Levantine spice routes.
Or look at the brutal conflicts in Southeast Asia, the Siamese-Malaccan Wars from 1446 to 1456.
What was the driver there?
The powerful kingdom of Siam recognized the immense wealth flowing through the Strait of Malacca. They repeatedly launched massive overland and naval invasions to crush the Malacca Sultanate and take control of the choke point.
Did they succeed?
Malacca was only saved by the desperate defense organized by their elite martial arts knights, most notably the legendary warrior Hang Tuah, backed by crucial diplomatic support from Ming China. The entire region was a powder keg.
And even when the European powers tried to settle things peacefully with treaties, the sheer scale of the numbers involved is mind-blowing. Take the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529.
Yes. Decades earlier, Spain and Portugal had basically divided the entire undiscovered world in half with the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Right.
But because they didn't fully understand longitude, they were both racing to reach the Spice Islands from opposite directions. Portugal sailing east, Spain sailing west.
Then they bumped into each other.
When Magellan's surviving crew arrived in the Maluku region, it sparked a massive geopolitical crisis between the two Catholic superpowers. To prevent an all-out war, they signed the Treaty of Zaragoza, where Spain officially sold its highly disputed claim to the Spice Islands to Portugal.
And what was the price?
The price: 350,000 gold ducats.
Good grief.
That is a staggering, economy-altering sum of gold, reflecting just how astronomically valuable those few volcanic islands were to the crown.
Which perfectly sets up what is unequivocally my absolute favorite story of the entire spice trade.
I know where you're going with this.
It is the ultimate real estate deal in human history. We have to talk about the island of Run.
Run. It is the perfect encapsulation of the madness of this era. Run is a tiny, microscopic speck of land in the Banda Islands.
How big is it?
It is roughly 2 miles long and barely a half-mile wide. You can walk across it in minutes. But in the 17th century, it was entirely covered in nutmeg trees. The British and the newly formed Dutch East India Company fought a bitter, decades-long war over this tiny rock.
A war over 2 miles of land.
It involved brutal naval sieges, the construction of massive forts, and horrifying atrocities, including the Dutch capturing and torturing the English merchants in what became known as the Amboina Massacre.
The obsession with this 2-mile island is just incomprehensible today. But they finally end the bloodshed in 1667, right?
Yes, with the Treaty of Breda. The European powers sit down to settle their global territorial disputes. The Dutch are absolutely adamant. They demand total, undisputed control of Run to finalize their absolute monopoly on the global nutmeg trade.
They won't back down.
They will not sign a peace treaty without it. In exchange for the British formally giving up their claim to Run, the Dutch agreed to hand over a small, heavily forested, seemingly much less valuable colony they held on the east coast of North America.
I want you to really think about this trade. The British give up a 2-mile island of nutmeg. In exchange, the Dutch hand over a colony in North America called New Amsterdam. And that colony, that dense forest the Dutch happily traded away, was the island of Manhattan.
Yes. New Amsterdam became New York.
That's crazy.
The Dutch traded away the future financial capital of the world because, at that specific moment in history, they genuinely believed a 2-mile island of nutmeg was vastly more valuable than the island of Manhattan.
It is the ultimate testament to how deeply warped and distorted the economic priorities of the era were due to the intoxicating value of spices.
It really is.
Okay, as we start to pull all of these massive historical threads together, I want to connect this to the bigger picture. If a modern macroeconomic policymaker, or an investment banker, or a financial trader is listening to this right now, what are the core lessons they need to take away from the age of spices? Because this isn't just ancient history, it's economic theory in action.
I think there are two massive, undeniable takeaways. First, absolute monopolies inevitably breed their own destruction.
How so?
The Mamluk Venetian cartel was so blinded by their own profitability, they squeezed their European customers so hard with that 33% tariff that they literally funded the Age of Discovery.
They forced their hand.
By making the traditional overland and Red Sea routes financially unviable, they forced Europe to invest massively in deep-sea navigation and maritime technology. That investment ultimately destroyed Venice's power, collapsed the Mamluk economy, and permanently shifted the center of the world economy from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. It is a stark warning to any modern cartel or monopoly.
Don't squeeze your customers to the point where they invent a way around you.
Exactly.
And the second major lesson.
The birth of the modern corporation and the stock market, the logistical and financial risks of shipping spices around the globe, were simply too massive for any single monarch, banking family, or merchant guild to bear alone.
Too much risk.
You had shipwrecks, piracy, and wildly fluctuating market prices. To mitigate this catastrophic risk, the Dutch created the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, and the British created the British East India Company.
The first mega corporations.
These were the very first multinational joint stock corporations. They allowed thousands of ordinary citizens to buy a small fraction of the risk and the reward. They literally birthed the modern stock market in Amsterdam.
Unbelievable.
The entire architecture of modern corporate capitalism, limited liability, shareholder dividends, corporate governance, was invented quite literally to share the immense risk of buying nutmeg.
It's genuinely mind-blowing when you trace it all back, and it leaves you with a really provocative final thought to mull over. If you look around at the geopolitical landscape today, what is the nutmeg of the 21st century?
That is the question.
Is it the rare earth metals required for electric batteries? Is it the advanced semiconductor microchips produced in Taiwan? Is it the massive server farms holding our global user data? Or is it the petrodollar itself? We are still fighting global cold wars over invisible, fragile supply chains. We are still trying to control strategic maritime choke points like the Strait of Hormuz or the South China Sea.
Nothing has changed.
We are still dealing with state-backed cartels and the exact same dynamics of information asymmetry. The commodities change, the ships are made of steel instead of wood, but the fundamental human behavior and the economic incentives do not change at all. The age of spices wasn't just a quirky culinary era about making dinner taste better. It was the intense, violent crucible that forged the modern global economy. And whether we realize it or not, we are all still living in it.
Well said.
If you like this talk and want to join us for more deep dives, please subscribe and like this channel. Thanks for listening.